Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Write Project podcast and radio program. This is a show about writing and modern Newfoundland author culture. This program is produced and recorded at CHMR FM 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is aired on other great stations in the province and elsewhere in the country. It can also be heard online at www.chmr.ca. I'm your host, Matthew LeDrew, author of the Infinity series and founder of Engine Books. Let's see what we have today. Thank you for joining us on the Write Project podcast, Andrew Peacock. Andrew Peacock is the author of many books and been involved in the writing community for some time. He wrote Creatures from the Rock, for which he won a Newfoundland Labrador Book Award, and A Brave Boy and His Cat. More recently, he wrote Viral, which came out in August 2020 and features a pandemic hitting the world and the effect that it has on Newfoundland closing its borders. I should state that he did not write that in August 2020. He wrote it several years before, meaning that he's in some way psychic. And coming out in 2021, he has Bifocal, a book that he's writing. It's a short story collection that features art in the form of photography with Kaylee Middlecoop. Did I get all that right, Andrew?
That sounds good. Great to be with you.
Excellent. All right. Well, can you tell me a little bit about Viral and the writing process and how that came to you, especially since it ended up being so prophetic? You know what I mean? Like, was it just you saw the way things were going, or it was a happy coincidence, or just tell me about it?
I guess it was a happy coincidence for me, maybe not for everybody else, but for me. The interest that I had in this topic stems from my experience as a veterinarian and specifically my experience as a student working in a lab animal facility. I worked while I was going to vet school in a monkey facility in Ottawa. And one of the predecessors of the veterinarian I worked for actually died from a bite from a monkey in the facility. So when we were working there, we were always very, very aware of how dangerous the monkeys were, that you were careful they didn't bite you. And as well as the immediate danger, of course, there was always the secondary danger of something getting out of the building and spreading around. You know, there's diseases like Ebola, Marburg disease, stuff like that, they just make COVID seem like a walk in the park, you know? Yeah. And I always wondered about what would happen if one of these things got out. The other thing that inspired me is there's a book called The Hot Zone. And it's not to be confused with the movie. The movie's really, it was based on the book, but they're really nothing like each other. In The Hot Zone, they talk about an Ebola that got loose in the United States. And at the end of the book, the guy who wrote it found one of the top researchers in this kind of work in the States, tracked him down and asked him, do you think it's possible there could ever be a virus that would get out and kill everybody in the world? And the guy's response was, no, that's silly. There could never be anything like that. At the very worst, I could imagine something killing 95% of the people in the world.
Oh, only 95%.
That's all. So
yeah.
It's not that bad.
Yeah.
And that's what sort of inspired me to write that book, reading that in The Hot Zone and then my own experience with monkeys. And we've heard for years and years that we've been overdue for a pandemic. You know, anybody who reads scientific literature shouldn't be too surprised by COVID. And in some ways, we're lucky that it was a coronavirus and not some other family of virus. It could have been a lot worse.
Yeah. Oh my God. It could have been airborne. It could have been much more virulent than it was. There's a lot of ways that can go wrong.
Yeah.
It's the experience with it was some years ago now, but I was watching an interview with someone, and this might be a horrible thing to say, but he was a viral enterologist who was on a talk show. I believe it's actually, I'm saying it was years ago. Maybe it just feels like years ago. Maybe it was the start of this pandemic, and that's why they were on there. But they were talking about they'd worked with AIDS back in the 90s, and he was expressing He was saying that he didn't think this one would get as out of control because everyone was on the same page. And he said something I'll never forget. And it was that if they'd wanted to, AIDS could have been solved with a pamphlet in the early days. Like if you just tried to educate people, it would have been fine. But there was too much indifference in the beginning. And then it obviously went out of control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing that's very interesting about something like a pandemic coming along is the response of people to it. Like it just mystifies me how people of a certain political persuasion have decided that wearing a mask is a political statement.
Yeah.
There's nothing political about it. It's a medical question, you know, and you can argue about the medicine of it. I don't think very well you can argue that it's not a good idea, but you could argue it. But the argument is about politics. It's about freedom and stuff like that. And I just don't understand that. It's another thing that the book Viral deals with in a sort of a sideways manner. There's kind of two stories to the book of Viral. One is the story of the pandemic, and it's of course a Newfoundland-based book.
Yep.
And in the story, without giving too much away, Newfoundland manages to close off, and it's the only place that doesn't have the virus. And then as a result of that, there's a certain kind of politics that comes to the fore. And it's sort of the populism that we're seeing south of the border now, you know, and how
hopefully coming in January.
That's right. You know, how do people react to someone who offers easy answers to big problems? And I think in the States, even before the pandemic, part of the appeal of the last president was that there was an awful lot of people in really bad financial state.
Yeah.
And somebody comes along and says, I can change things, you know, and I've got easy answers to this. There's a simple way to fix this. And people jump onto that. And that's one of the ideas of Viral, that somebody comes along in Newfoundland and says, this is easy to fix, you know, there's a simple solution to this.
There's never a simple solution. Well, even like there are simple problems, but there are rarely simple solutions that are actual solutions, I've learned.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that completely.
Yeah. But yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I've been tongue in cheek. I hope nobody ever takes me seriously, but I've been selling the book when I'm there in person as, would you like to know how this ends? But I'm thankfully, we're at a point where there was recently this will be aired in a few weeks. So hopefully by that point, we will have the vaccines that they were promising a few days ago and stuff like that. This is a time will tell. I'll put in that this was recorded on December 7th. So it's possible that some of this will be out of date by the time this airs. I hope. Yeah. Andrew Peacock, what are common traps for aspiring authors? Things that aspiring authors do that get them stuck up in the process kind of thing and not producing work?
Facebook, number one.
Yes, if that's fair.
Yeah.
I had that happen earlier today.
Yeah. The other thing that I think is a trap is the idea that you have to write well.
Yeah.
You can write junk. That's okay.
That's
and
fair.
You can fix it up later. It's more important to write than to write well.
I agree. Actually, that's a surprising answer, but I agree. Like I always say, perfect is the enemy of great, great is the enemy of good, and good is the enemy of done. Like all a first draft has to be is done.
Yes.
Second draft has to be good. A third draft has to be great. You know what I mean?
And the first draft, you can throw half of it out, or you can throw 3/4 of it out. That's fine.
Yep. I have thrown entire drafts out.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Horrible. Okay. Andrew Peacock, if you could tell your younger writing self any one thing, what would it be?
I think I would. That's a tough one. My immediate reaction to it is to say I should have started writing earlier. You know,
Sure.
You should have started writing earlier. But I was just watching a lecture by another writer, And he said that in the lecture, he said he couldn't understand how people wrote books when they were 20 because they hadn't lived enough. And in that vein, I haven't, in some ways, I have no regrets about starting later because I've done a lot of things.
Yeah.
And I've thought a lot about the way the world works. And I think all of that was preparation for writing. You know, people ask me, my first book was a memoir, Creatures of the Rock. And people ask me, how long did it take you to write that? And the glib answer all the time was 35 years.
Yeah.
You know, I had to live that book before I could write it.
Yeah.
So I think there's something to that, that there is some value to living some before you write.
For sure. As someone who wrote very young and you know, I'm not old now by any means, but you know what I mean, like who's been writing for a while, I'll say that I like my current stuff better, but that's always the case, you know.
Yeah.
I sometimes in my more melancholy moments, I will wish that the other stuff was no longer in print, the older stuff, but here
It's
we
an
are.
it's an interesting question. It's an interesting dilemma because there are also artists, and maybe writing is different than other art, but particularly in music, people tend to make their best music when they're young.
I will say that the stuff I wrote when I was young was the most emotionally raw, and I there was this kind of fearlessness and this kind of screw the world kind of like energy to it that I can't get back now. I'm more reserved.
That'll come
I
back, that'll come back to you in 20 or 30 years when you don't care about anything.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Once the kids have grown up, it will
That's
come.
right. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah. That makes perfect sense, actually. Yeah, it's interesting. I also, when I'm always cautious when I'm speaking to writing students to say that when I say a young writer, I don't necessarily mean someone who's young in age. I mean someone who is trying to write for the first time. And there are
That,
some mistakes that you will make regardless of if your first book is written at 16 or 60, you know?
absolutely. Absolutely. That's a good point.
Andrew Peacock, what is the best money you ever spent as a writer on your writing career or to help you with your writing or whatever?
Probably my most recent computer. I've got a lovely little MacBook Air that's got a long-lasting battery, and it's been helpful.
What did you do with your first advance?
I didn't do anything with it. I just basically put it in the bank.
Yep, makes sense.
My situation is a little different than a lot of writers. I had a good career as a veterinarian and came to writing after that. And I have been lucky enough to never write with money being a priority in my writing. I want to write good books. I want to write well. If I make some money, the main thing that that tells me is that people are enjoying my books, which is what I would really like.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful answer. It's a great spot to have to, or to be able to be in to
Yeah,
really just focus on the art.
and I don't want to be too precious about that because I understand that a lot of writers don't have that possibility. You know, it's just that where I come at the work in my life.
Absolutely. And I think in some ways that does reflect positively in your work, in that, like, say, when I'm writing a book, I'm proudest of the work that I've done when I wrote what I wanted and didn't care if it was going to be commercial or not. There's a novella I wrote, Touch Your Nose, which it's a spy thriller, and anyone who reads it who presumably likes spy thrillers will hate me by the end of it. Like it's just has this twist at the end that is meant to anger fans of spy thrillers. But I really wanted to write this work, and I felt strongly about it artistically, and so I did it. But those are few and far between. Usually, somewhere in the back of my head is the commercial viability of it, and I wish that wasn't there, because then everything could be my proudest work, like Touch Your Noses, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it shows in your work. I think your stuff is very artistic in that way.
Thank you.
Andrew Peacock, what was an early experience you had where you learned that language had power?
I guess I learned that in my work as a veterinarian, not that early, but certainly in my 20s. I found out that being able to communicate with my clients was more important than knowing the right drugs and knowing all the details of pathology and medicine and stuff like that. Communication, if you don't have it, you can have an animal with a sick horse, and if you can't convince the guy to treat the animal, he's never going to get better.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense, actually. Okay. Andrew Peacock, in your opinion, what is the most unethical practice in the publishing industry right now?
Unethical. That's a tough one.
That is one that some people skip, only because one person laughed and said, "My book's not out yet, and I'm with a major publisher. Are you trying to get me killed?"
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard the recent suggested sale of who is it? One of the big publishers to Random House.
Yes, we are. We still use the term Big Five, even though for quite a while it's been a Big Four because Penguin and Random House merged, and now more are merging, so it will in fact be a Big Three.
And I don't know if unethical is the right word for it, but it's worrying,
Well, I mean, at some point, a monopoly is unethical.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're there yet, but at some point,
Mm-hmm. And there's two sides to that too, because I think that it can get to the point where there may be even advantage to small publishers from things getting squeezed too tight into one place,
Yeah.
I don't know how this is going to play out. And the other thing that I know, having a book published with Penguin Random House, there are very good people and very good, ethical people within those companies.
Yeah, but no, absolutely.
Yeah, but it is problematic. It's certainly problematic. These companies getting bigger and bigger.
I mean, I could say and get myself in trouble, so I won't say it out loud, but we'll both know who we're talking about. But we could say the same thing about some certain big box bookstores that kind of have come in and destroyed all the little local bookstores and or just taken up so much of the market. I can be angry at that large company while still understanding that just about everyone who works for that big box store is there because they love books and love the industry and want to be in the industry,
It's really tricky stuff because we know as consumers, whether it's books or whether it's groceries or whether it's a pair of pants, if we can buy something for half price, we're likely going to do it.
Yeah.
So we get our pants at Walmart instead of getting them at a local fashion designer. I used to run a bookstore in Carbonear, and and we got to the point where I used to go into Costco and I could buy books from Costco cheaper than I could get them from the publishers.
I am right there with you. I was at a book fair with one of my like a book tour with an author from a competitor, and they hadn't sent her out copies of the book. So when you're done with the question period, I had copies of my book there to sell, and this author didn't have copies of theirs. And I said to myself, darn it, I could have gone and bought them at Costco for $9.99, sold them for the $20 price tag, and made a killing selling a rival's books.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is borderline unethical in and of itself.
Yeah. And it's a strange old world, because that's so terrible. And yet that's kind of nice to get a book for $9.99.
It is. It's horrible because what you want as a consumer is directly in competition with what you want as a business person.
Yeah.
It's a strange world. Andrew Peacock, what are the most important magazines, in your opinion, for writers to subscribe to? Or if if magazines isn't the right question to ask, I've updated it for people to do newsletters and blogs, and podcasts, stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm not one who reads much in terms of magazines or listens to much in blogs. To me, I think the important thing for a writer is to read books. I think that's more important than reading. I have to be careful here. I think it's important to read about writing too.
Yeah.
But I would be much more interested in reading a book by a good writer than reading a blog by somebody who's the latest flash in the pan about writing, you know? Or even in a magazine, the latest idea about how fiction should work. I'd rather sit down with John Gardner's Art of Fiction or something like that, you know, a real classic, and dig right into it. That's my preference.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew Peacock, how do you balance making demands of your reader with taking care of the reader?
I give my readers a lot of credit. I don't worry too much about them. I think the thing that I don't want to do is, you don't want to show off with technique and vocabulary and stuff like that. You get that feeling in some books that people are using big words, and it's just like, you use that word because it was big, not because it was the best word, you know?
Yeah.
And I love it when I come across a word in a book that, you know, is difficult, and you maybe look the word up and you go, that's perfect. That's the perfect word. I think that's fine. And then I think the same thing with twists in the plot and things like that. Like, I enjoy a puzzle, and I enjoy something that makes me think twice about it. Viral, I think, works a little bit that way. There's, I've heard all kinds of ideas about what people think is going on in Viral and what happens in the end and stuff like that. It's all over the place, and I love that. And it doesn't seem to bother people. And there are some people that say, I didn't really understand what happened in this part, but it didn't bother me.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the way that I look at it too. I'm not worried about being completely transparent with everything and making everything really obvious. I'd like you to work a little bit at the book, you know, to figure some of what's going on in it.
For sure.
No, and you can do that in two ways. I think that bothers me sometimes in books. And one of the things I think that I try to do for my readers is try to not confuse them at the beginning of the book. You know, I'd like to set it up fairly clearly who the characters are, what the relationship is between the characters. It drives me up the wall when I read a book and there's 6 characters on the first page, and I'm not sure whether it's a girlfriend or a sister or a mother, you know, what the relationship is between these people. And you're working at it and working at it as you read, and 10 pages in, you realize, oh, that's not his mother, it's his daughter, you know?
Yeah.
I don't like that in a book.
No, I agree. There's something to be said for almost like you would with a child, leading the reader by the hand for the first few steps. And then by the time you're done, let's call it Act 1, then you let them walk on their own and be like, here's what I've set up for you. Go play.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I've never thought about it in that way, but that's exactly how I try to do it, that I try to, you know, set you up fairly comfortably, and then now you can do some work.
Yeah. Go out there, figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. I find I know some people who are avid readers, but it's going to sound horrible, but I don't consider them good readers, because they are the type who do want everything explained. Like an ambiguous ending makes them very, very angry.
Yeah.
And we were one person in particular I was in a book club with. They're not a writer, and they would get very angry whenever, you know, a book with an ambiguous ending came out, and just be like, how did it end? And I was like, how do you think it ended? Like, they're asking you, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, one of the real delights to me in talking to people who read your work is the surprise that you get at some people who seem not to be sophisticated writers, maybe don't have too much education, and boy, they get it, you know?
Yeah.
and they're ready for challenging stuff, and they have interesting ideas about what's happening. And I find that's just a real joy to me when I get that.
I agree. Andrew Peacock, as a writer, what would you choose as your animal representation for your writing career? A mascot or avatar, if you would.
Probably a dog.
All right. That sounds right. Yeah.
Something that you can depend on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Andrew Peacock, who inspired you to write?
There's been a couple of things. My dad always told us very funny stories when we were kids. My brother and I both. He made up these stories that were just, it's too bad none of them were ever written down. They were just ridiculous, stories about a family that didn't have much money and lived on paper sandwiches and water sandwiches, that kind of stuff.
Water sandwiches.
Silly story. Yeah. And my brother ended up becoming a writer. He's a full-time writer and has been nominated for the Governor General's Award, and so has books that have sold 50,000 copies. He's quite successful. So my brother's definitely an inspiration as well. And everybody knows that your brother's not that bright, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So if he can do it,
yeah,
I can do it.
That's horrible.
And I'm not speaking specifically about my brother. I just mean brothers in general.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Where you look at a sibling and you're like, I swear that happens with my immediate family now. Like that the publishing company is starting to do well and stuff like that. Whereas before they were like, oh, this seems difficult, but now that we're doing it well, they're like, well, it can't be that difficult because Matt's doing it. And I'm like,
obviously.
Yeah.
Obviously, anybody could do it because my brother can do it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, I see how it is. Yeah. It was insurmountable until I surmounted it, at which point anyone could have done that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Andrew Peacock, what are you reading right now?
Right now, I'm reading two things. I'm reading River Thieves by Michael Crummy.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm just starting into another Murakami book, one of my favorite writers.
Nice. They've been mentioned on this show before, actually. Yeah, they're wonderful. Andrew Peacock, what is a word that you cannot spell? If this word shows up in your book, that means autocorrect spelled that word or spell check or whatever.
I just found out going through the edits for bifocal, apparently I can't spell center.
Are you doing the American spelling?
Yes.
Yeah. That's common. Yeah. I'm so bad for that. The early Black Wound or the Coral Beach Case Files books, my early books, I made a disastrous choice that has since been fixed. But there's always the debate of Canadian/British English or American English for the spelling of things, and which should you do? You're a Canadian writer, but you want it to have universal appeal, and the stories are set in America. I made the disastrous choice of choosing which spelling I wanted to use based on the word. Just be like, I like the Canadian spelling of color, but I like the American spelling of honored, and just pick and choose for each one. Don't do that.
Well, I have to say, Matt, I like that.
Me too.
We'll never get away with it, but I do like that.
No, I like it too, and I tried when we started to become serious, sat down with my editor-in-chief and we did a style guide, and I was like, so this is how we do it, and she was like, no, you do not.
Maybe you got to do poetry to do that.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay, well, to those listening, you can check out Viral now wherever finer books are sold, either in store or on the Engine website or on Amazon. And you should be able to pre-order you should be able to pre-order Bifocal when this interview goes live. If not, order it. But no, I think we'll still be in pre-order stage. Okay.
All right, well, thanks for coming on again. For all of you, we'll be here again next week at 4:30 Newfoundland time or online at chmr.ca. Please tune in and we'll talk more about writing culture in Newfoundland.